old. His father put him on a ship and said, "Go learn something, son. Goodbye." Well, he was good at it. He was smart, studious, attentive, tall, charming, athletic. Everything that I am except the smart part. Captain Cook was also well liked by the old salts on the boat. He had a charm about him that was inescapable. He was a very good artist with pencil and paper. At a young age, he learned to use a French invention called a planer table. A planer table is like two gun sights lined up designed to measure linear distances, and it was a brand new invention. Well, with this new invention and his gift of art, he became the world's foremost cartographer. At the age of 13, he drew a map of Newfoundland that to this day, if you superimpose the satellite photo of Newfoundland on top of Cook's map, at 13 years old, it's a dead hit match. Cove for cove, corner for corner. It is spot on. It's really impressive. At the age of 16, he got his first command. He drove a coal ship up and down the coast of England. At the age of 21, he was given his first commission in the British Royal Navy and placed in charge of a 36-gun frigate and 200 men. In those days, that was the equivalent of a modern nuclear aircraft carrier. And a 21-year-old was running the show. Give that some thought. Cook is widely regarded as the man who figured out scurvy. He realized, or had the intuition, that it was nutritional based. So he brought sauerkraut on the voyages. You see, sauerkraut is the perfect food to take on a long voyage because when you put it aboard the ship, it's spoiled. And 3 years later, it's still spoiled. His men hated this stuff. So he used psychology to get his men to eat their sauerkraut. He told the cooks that the sauerkraut was only to be served to the officers in the officers' mess. And then all of a sudden, his sailors, true to their nature, acted like children. "Where's our sauerkraut?" Worked like a charm. He sent his cooks and botanists ashore to experiment with the local plants. They realized that some were yummy, some were yucky, and some were poisonous. They put the yummy and the yucky ones in a pot and made soup. And the man hated it. So how do you get a sailor to do just about anything?
Alcohol.
Right. For everybody that finished their little cup of soup after their meal each night, they were given an extra serving of rum. Like a charm. Cook also realized that fleas and lice were a problem on the boat. So, he enforced a level of hygiene that was unheard of before. He made his men bathe and shave and clean the boat. Dunk their linens in the ocean and dry them and beat them with sticks to get the salt out. Now, bathing in the 1700s was unheard of. Nobody ever took a bath. And so this was a very novel approach to cleanliness aboard a ship. That's not a beer. Shit. Cook also realized that rats and mice were a problem. So he brought kitty cats on the voyages. Unfortunately, there was a problem there too. When you've been at sea for about 3 months and you're running out of food, a little mouse starts to look rather yummy. But who wants to eat poor kitty, right? His men were incredibly resistant to the idea of putting their beloved pets into a stew pot, so to speak. Now, Cook made 3 major trips around the planet. On his first voyage, he was sent to the South Pacific, to the island of Tahiti, to measure what's known as the transit of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to cross the face of the sun. He took clocks and telescopes with him. There were 9 voyages that were sent by 5 nations to go and accomplish the same thing. It was the very first time in human history that we cooperated as an international community on a science project. Everybody failed, except for Captain Cook, and they all failed for the same reason. When they got to where they were going, the clocks weren't working. Cook had 3 clocks on board his ship, and 2 of them were broken. Guess where the 3rd clock was built? It's an easy one. Switzerland. Runs like a Swiss clock, right? That's where the phrase comes from. Cook measured the transit of Venus, brought that one piece of data back to England, And with that one piece of data, astronomers were able to calculate the size of the sun, the size of the 4 interior planets, their orbits, and their distances from each other. One piece of data unlocked the solar system. On his third voyage, Captain Cook was sent to discover the Northwest Passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean over the North American continent. He sailed up through the Bering Strait, ran into a wall of ice, bounced around for a couple of months, but winter was setting in, so it was time to go south and find a place to restock the ships and rest the men. At this time, there was rumors that in the middle of the Pacific Ocean there was land. The British thought so, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, everybody thought so. Nobody quite knew where yet. Well, Cook sailed south from the Bering Sea and ran smack dab into the island of Kauai. Sailed into Waimea Bay, and Hawaiians were friendly. He was able to exchange metal and trinkets and beads and things for food, but because Kauai is such a small island, the exchange rates for the food was rather expensive, as Hawaii can be. 5.5 weeks passed in a flash, time to go back to work. On the second leg of this third voyage, Cook sailed up the west coast of Canada, sailed into the Cook Inlet, discovered the Kenai Peninsula, the Aleutian Islands, sailed up into the Bering Strait, went down the east coast of Russia and to the northern island Hokkaido of Japan. He did all of that in 7.5 months. That is one of the more remarkable, that's the second greatest achievement in sailing history of all time, behind Magellan's navigation of the Straits of Magellan, which was unbelievable. Nonetheless, winter was setting in. Let's go back to Hawaii. They came to the north coast of Maui, where Cook was coasting along the north edge of Maui. Canoes were coming out with fresh food and vegetables and water, but unfortunately his men, being in the sight of land and women, were freaking out because they weren't going to shore. Cook coasted along the coast of Maui, was given good advice by the king to head on over to Kealakekua Bay, big safe bay, bigger island, more food, better exchange rate, all of that. Cook decided he would circumnavigate the big island. He had no idea how big the big island was. As he was sailing down the Hamakua coast of the Waipio Valley there, trade winds were blowing his ships toward the shore. The sun was setting. His lumbering ships were unable to tack against the wind, away from the surf. It was getting darker and darker. Panic was setting in. So he dropped his sails, launched his longboats, tied tow ropes to his big ships, and his men are in the longboats, rowing for their lives, trying to keep their ships from being dashed on the rocks in the surf. Turns out, there was snow on our mountains. So when it got dark, these convective winds that blow uphill all day long turned into these cool Malca breezes blowing down the mountain and blew his ships out to safety. He woke up the next morning, he was 17 miles offshore. He had to turn around and refine the island. He sailed around South Point, came right up the coast, sailed right into this bay. 2 enormous brown ships with huge white sails sailed right here into this bay, where he was greeted by 20,000 people just in the water. Swimmers, and paddlers, and canoes. Now, let me ask you something. How is it that you think you discovered a place that had 1 million people living there? Because, folks, Columbus didn't discover a damn thing either. Think about it for a minute. Nonetheless, Hawaiians were friendly. It was the season of the Makahiki. During Makahiki, peaceful god Lono reigns, and there is a kapu against argument. Wives are not allowed to nag their husbands. Fathers are not allowed to yell at their children. And siblings are not allowed to argue with each other. And there's only one punishment. It's death. The peace will be enforced during Makahiki, and there will be no exceptions to that. It was the way the Hawaiians culled the herd every year, so to speak. Getting rid of that bad element. Times were good. Exchange rates were favorable. We filled the ships with food. And it was great. Time to go back to work. 5.5 weeks passed in a flash. Sailed up the west coast of this island. He was going to go back to Maui to thank the king for such good advice and take him some gifts. He started to cross the L.A. Nui Haha Channel between here and Maui, widely regarded as the second most treacherous stretch of water on the planet. I have crossed it twice. It almost killed me both times. Captain Cook got into the teeth of the channel when the main mast of his ship was snapped in half. Ah, well, let's go back to the bay. We'll find a tree. We'll fix the boat. Everything's gonna be fine. Sailed into the bay, where he was greeted by nobody. It was like a ghost town. Hawaiians realized a few things at this point. Number one, they felt cheated out of a tremendous amount of supplies for not a very good exchange rate. And number two, some of their women were sick and they weren't quite sure why. Captain Cook did not realize that the Makihiki was over. It was now the season of the war god, Ku Kailimoku. Hawaiians were making preparations to go to battle against the other islands in a centuries-long civil war that existed here forever, that I talked about in the last story. One thing led to another, and a longboat was stolen from his ship in the middle of the night. It was taken ashore here in Kavaloa, where it was burned to recover the metal fasteners. When Cook awoke the next morning, he was furious. He gathered up a band of Marines, and he went ashore. He was going to take the High Chief hostage, Kalani'opu'u, and ransom him for the boat. Very bad plan. A scuffle broke out. A shot was fired, and the Hawaiians descended on the sailors like savages. They all jumped into the water and swam to the longboats and were towed to the ships, or were rowed to the ships for safety. Everyone except for Captain Cook. He couldn't swim. The captain always goes down with his ship. See, in those days, captains never, ever, 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 ever got off the boat, unless it was to get on another ship. They seldom went ashore, and they just never swam. Cook was clubbed to death on February the 14th of 1779, right there. And the High Chief took his body and burned it and stripped all the flesh from the bones. The Hawaiians believed that the spiritual power of a man, his mana, rests in the bones. And they had a lot of respect for Cook. He had these big, tall sailing ships, and metal, and gunpowder, and gunpowder, and gunpowder, and gunpowder. Gunpowder was a magic trick to the Hawaiians. It was awesome. Well, he took this bag of bones and he marched around the entire big island to district upon district, where he distributed some bones to every chief of every district on the big island in order to spread Cook's mana around. The monument was erected in the 1880s. The Kingdom of Hawaii gave that land to Great Britain, and to this day it still is Great Britain right there. They put that monument up in his honor. But here's the punchline. In 1974, in New Zealand, a man named J.C. Beaglehole gathered together every piece of literature that's ever been written about Captain Cook. All of his journals, and that's incredible because he wrote anywhere between 5 and 20 pages every single day of his whole career. He was a prolific writer. He also gathered together all the logs and journals of all of his officers and of all the men aboard all of his ships that kept a journal that was still existing. He gathered up all this information. It was a room full of paper. He went through it page by page, and he wrote the definitive biography of Captain James Cook. It's 1,200 pages long, and only 31 of those pages is devoted to what happened here in Kelikiko Bay. His life was remarkable. He cured scurvy, fleas and lice, rats and mice, measured the transit of Venus, unlocking the secrets to the solar system. He explored, measured, and mapped the entire Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from Australia to Easter Island, the Great Barrier Reef, and 1,000 islands along the way. And he was only 50 years old when he died. Incredible. Historians unanimously agree that he's without question the single greatest explorer in history, beyond Magellan, beyond Marco Polo, beyond Neil Armstrong. No one can match the overall resume of Captain James Cook. Incredible accomplishments. Of the 3 major voyages that he made around the planet, they all lasted between 2 and 4 years. He lost not one single man to scurvy. That was unheard of. In 1540, 36 to 40, Magellan, in his attempt to circumnavigate the globe, started with 236 men and 5 ships. 1 ship and 18 guys made it back. And most all of those guys died from scurvy along the way. Very few were killed by natives or by accidents. They all died from scurvy. So now flash forward just 200 years, and here's Captain Cook figuring out the plague that has been killing sailors forever. Pretty good story, huh? I swear to God, it's mostly true.
Have you read?
Yeah, I've read it 3 times and I studied it extensively, and I've also was a docent on board the USS, the HMS Endeavour, which is the replica ship of Captain Cook's first boat. I got to be a docent on board that ship for 3 days. I was here in Kona back in the 90s. It was really cool. I got to sleep aboard the boat one night, the second or third night they were here, and the surf was building, and they were docked on the pier in Kona there, and the tide was high when it was night, about 10 o'clock at night. The tide was high, and I saw that the tide was very high, and that all of the spring lines were pretty tight, but not too tight. And as the tide lowered and the surf was coming in and out, the boat on the pier, as the tide lowers, the spring lines are getting looser and looser and looser. The boat is getting more and more and more weight on it as the hours go by. Boom! Boom! And I mean more and more and more momentum. And at about 3 in the morning, the gangway was hoisted, smashed into the large wooden structure they built with the staircases to help people get up onto the boat, onto the gangway. And the forward spring line snapped off the crown of one of the steam bent timbers to the rib of the ship. These timbers were 16 by 16 solid oak, steam bent to the keel. And it snapped off a piece that was probably 2.5 feet tall, 16 by 16, which was a crown of the timber up above the gunnel line. Snapped it off like a toothpick. The carpenter came up on, we all came up on deck because it sounded like an explosion went off. And we all come running up on deck, and we look, and man, the timber's floating in the water, and the carpenter looks at it, and I'm standing right next to the ship's carpenter when this happened, and he looks at it and he goes, "Oh my God, this is going to ruin the ship." This is exactly what I see. And today, the ship is in New Zealand, in Auckland, and it is a floating museum that doesn't see it. Yeah. So there are some weird karmic something going on there, yeah? Yeah? Don't you think? Alright. Need some food, you skinny Joyce.